Hiya folks, Carl James here from Electric Media Madness, joining me for another episode of Strange Tales. Today I want to talk a little bit about science fiction's portrayal of covered up or faked space missions, the kind of subject that's dated back many decades and also seems to run curiously parallel with a lot of the strange phenomenon that's gone over the years with NASA and the kind of things that they might actually have covered up. A more expansive subject for another video, but today I just want to concentrate on a certain group of films and how that subject is there to some degree within the narrative of these films. In 1955, in a February issue of Galaxy Science Fiction magazine, author James Gunn published a story entitled The Cave of Night. The story deals with a manned mission to Mars which goes awry, stranding an astronaut with no hope of rescue. The climax of the story is actually quite shocking. It utilises the notions of fakery to portray an erroneous perception of the outcome of the mission. Another film from 1968 entitled Countdown featured a fictional secret space program called Pilgrim that ran parallel with Apollo. The production was also fully supported by NASA. The 1969 movie Marooned also featured a manned mission to the moon going wrong. Failure of the re-entry rocket leaves the occupants of the lunar capsule stranded in space. Although there's no cover-up inherent in the actual plot of that movie, an alleged early draft of the script called for a smokescreen story created to perpetuate the idea of a heroic attempt to rescue the astronauts should they have perished. Like Countdown, Marooned was also given full support from NASA, including the use of Cape Kennedy for interior and exterior location shooting. The Apollo command module used in the making of the film was actually a boilerplate version of the Block 1 Apollo spacecraft. In more recent years, the film Apollo 18 used the lost footage plot device, popularised by films like the Blair Witch Project, to posit the idea that NASA carried out a secret manned mission to the moon. In this case, it was actually Apollo 18 mission, involving NASA astronauts landing on the moon in 1974. In that film, the Apollo 18 mission is covered up following the discovery of an extraterrestrial insect-like organism on the moon, an organism that subsequently kills the Apollo 18 crew. Interestingly, that film shows the astronauts discovering a dead cosmonaut along with a Soviet landing module on the lunar surface, suggesting that, like NASA, the Soviets were also conducting clandestine missions and cover-ups. And the reality of that latter concept has been studied by a number of researchers. It's known as the lost cosmonaut paradigm. And whilst evidence of the Soviet space cover-up isn't as obvious as the likes of NASA may be, at least one account has evidentially been verified. I'm probably going to butcher his name here, but there was a chap called Valentin Bondarenko, who was a would-be cosmonaut whose death during training was actually covered up for decades by the Soviet government. Now, in 1960, the science fiction author Robert Heinlein wrote an article for Pravda describing how, whilst in the Vilnius region of Soviet-occupied Lithuania in May 15th, 1960, he was told by a Red Army cadet that the USSR had launched a man into orbit that day, and the account was denied by officials later the same day. Heinlein elaborated on that story in a speech he gave at the 19th World Science Fiction Convention, Seattle, in 1961. He said, "A Russian cosmonaut is circling the Earth." All the other cadets nodded agreement to everything he said and sometimes added details. I congratulated them on a country's wonderful scientific achievement with a frozen smile and a sick feeling in my stomach. We talked a bit more about it, then they went on up the hill and we went down. That afternoon we tried very hard to get a copy of Pravda. None were available anywhere. We did listen to the voice of Moscow. Mrs. Heinlein told me that it did report the rocket, but just as one of the Sputnik, no mention of a passenger. That evening our guide joined us to go to the ballet, and she immediately told us that the cadet had been mistaken. It was not a rocket ship with a man in it, just a dummy. The cadet had misunderstood. Well, perhaps so, but if so, then all those dozens or more cadets were mistaken exactly the same way. When we talk about science fiction luminaries who have questioned the official narrative on certain aspects of space programs, whether that be the Americans or the Russians, another notable sci-fi writer here who's expressed views about the Apollo cover-up, as it were, is Canadian novelist Margaret Atwood. In a 2009 interview, Atwood questioned the technology of the 1960s, why man hasn't landed on the moon again, and mentioned the shadow discrepancies as well as the radiation belts. Atwood ordered the dystopian novel The Handmaid's Tale, a story which addressed such agenda concepts, as I call them, as population reduction, female fertility and ecological disaster. Another interesting curio is the film Futureworld from 1976. That film takes place in a futuristic theme park called Delos. It's actually a sequel to the film Westworld. The setting in that film has a number of zones where vacationers can immerse themselves in a recreated environment or historical period and pretend that they're actually there. One zone, called Futureworld, and the aforementioned name of the film, is a simulation, therefore fakery I suppose, of space travel and missions to the likes of the Moon and Mars. NASA's credited support of the film's production principally involved the use of Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center, Houston, Texas, utilising NASA's Mission Control Center to stand in for Futureworld's Operations Center. In the film, that setting even has images on the monitors of fake lunar landers carrying passengers pretending to be on a mission to the moon. The film's end credits also thank another NASA, what I call a gender-associated agency, ARPA, which actually ended up becoming DARPA, for their help in the film. It says, animated face and animated hand film produced by Dr. Frederick Ira Park and Edwin Earl Catmull, University of Utah Computer Science Department, and supported by the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, under contract number F30602-70-C-300. A little side note that I want to point out here is that Edwin Earl Catmull, who was the co-creator of the animation in the film, went on to become one of the co-founders of Hollywood's Pixar animation studios. Catmull was employed by George Lucas at Lucasfilm, Francis Ford Coppola in 1979, leading him to become the vice president of Industrial Light and Magic Computer Graphics Division at Lucasfilm. As of 2016, he was president of Pixar Animation Studios and Walt Disney Animation Studios. Disney has an historical connections to things like NASA and that, but again, that's a subject for another video. There is another film that I want to mention here, but I don't want to get into it in too much detail because I'm trying to save this for another video where I can talk about it more at length, but that's actually Capricorn One from 1977. That film was directed by Peter Hyams, who also helmed 2010, which was a sequel to Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, so we have some synchronicity there. And Capricorn One featured a plot that utilised Hollywood trickery and gimmicks to fake the first manned mission to Mars. And in the film, the astronaut crew are removed from their rocket, driven to a film set in the desert to record fake footage of their planetary touchdown. The film also details an effort to kill the astronauts after their decision to blow the whistle on the whole scam. Details of NASA's support of that are generically documented in Frederick C. Sabin's The Making of Capricorn One. Quote, to stay within budget, NASA's cooperation was needed. Lazarus, producer Paul N. Nazareth III, had a good relation with space agency from Futureworld, so the aforementioned Futureworld. The filmmakers were thus able to obtain government equipment as props despite the negative portrayal of the space agency, including a prototype lunar module. One of the things that I should mention here that for many years, Peter Hyams denied that NASA was ever involved with that film. There's a lot more to that subject which I will get into in another video. I mentioned there as well 2001 A Space Odyssey. I don't want to get into the full scope of that with this video because again, that is something for a much longer video. But one of the things that I do want to point out here is that the film was released in 1968, over a year before the Apollo 11 missions, and the film's narrative features a cover-up of a sort, a story perpetuated about the spread of a fictitious virus, prompting a quarantine of the lunar base in the film to hide the discovery of an extraterrestrial artifact. In this case, it was the Tycho monolith on the moon. That spurred on the subsequent mission to the planet Jupiter, which also had a secret agenda, as it were, in the film. There's another recent addition to this idea of Apollo fakery referenced in mainstream science fiction films. This came in the form of Christopher Nolan's Interstellar. The film set in a future when manned space exploration is seemingly non-existent. Although the plot of the film has actually got nothing to do with the Apollo missions and the man on the moon concept, an early scene in the film refers to an Apollo cover-up of sorts. The scene involves former NASA astronaut Cooper attending a meeting with his daughter's school teacher. Apparently his daughter Murphy won't accept the school-taught history of the Apollo missions. This is the dialogue from the film. The teacher says, "It's an old federal textbook. We've replaced them all with corrected versions." Cooper asks, "Corrected?" The teacher says, explaining how the Apollo missions were faked to bankrupt the Soviet Union. Cooper replies, "You don't believe we went to the moon?" The teacher says, "I believe it was a brilliant piece of propaganda that the Soviets bankrupt themselves, pouring resources into rockets and other useless machines." Cooper incredulently says, "Useless machines?" And the teacher replies, "If we don't want a repeat of the excess and wastelessness of the 20th century, then we need to teach our kids about this planet, not tales about leaving it. Following an exchange about the death of Cooper's wife, the teacher continues, Murph got into a fistfight with several of her classmates over this Apollo nonsense. Now, after the film came out, the scene prompted a number of researchers like myself to ask questions if the film's producers had attempted to insert some kind of subtle form of disclosure, whether that be to do with secret space programs or whether that's just to do with generally fakery, the notion of fakery to do with NASA and things like that. There are some interesting plot points that superficially hint at that kind of thing, such as the mass belief that NASA no longer exists, when in fact it does in the film, and they're also conducting a secret space program of its own at that point in the film. Indeed, Michael Caine's character in the film, Dr. John Brand, comments, "They needed us back in secret because public opinion wouldn't allow spending on space exploration." However, that film, like all contemporary Hollywood science fiction, I would argue, simply performs several sleight of hands and double bluffs. The author of a 2015 article entitled "Was the movie Interstellar or Backhanded Admissions of the Moon Hoax?" noted one cursory example in the film. The author says, "If you listen carefully, they didn't say that the moon landings were faked, but that they had to say that they were faked for the purpose of bankrupting the Soviet Union. In other words, we really went there, but we can't admit it anymore because it gives people false hope." On a deeper level, that scene reinforces this idea of the mainstream history, as it were, of the Cold War paradigm, and also the Soviets' role in another mainstream narrative, that of the space race. Now, there is a lot of evidence out there that suggests that the Cold War paradigm has been somewhat fudged, and there's a mass perceived version of it, as it were. I've documented a lot of stuff in Science Fiction and the Hidden Global Agenda Volume 2 about this group called Team B that was reporting on what level of weaponry and development that the Russians had. Were actually lying about it to the Americans, which was creating like a back and forth. So that was in some ways driving this idea of we've got to defend ourselves in a certain way. A lot of it was based on a false narrative, but that's a subject again for another time. But that idea of the Cold War driving the space race, as it were, is a central tenet of a far more recent television show called For All Mankind. Now, I actually quite like For All Mankind. It's a great show. One of the things there's several things that I like about it is that it's incredibly well written. The main guy that's writing it is Ronald D. Moore, who's always put out some really, really good stuff. He worked on Star Trek Next Generation, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, the remake of Battlestar Galactica. If nothing else, he's always been a very tight runner of the ship, where it were. He has some great ideas. He knows how to produce these shows really, really well. For All Mankind is incredibly well written. It's incredibly well acted. One of the things that I take issue with nowadays in television is how diversity, equity and inclusion is promoted in TV shows, but I believe that if you're going to do this, there's a good way of doing it. You don't need to preach and bash people over their heads. For All Mankind is a great show for doing that. It does it very, very well. It does the whole diversity and inclusion thing in a good way. It doesn't preach to the audience. It doesn't bash people over the head. It doesn't make people feel in any way uncomfortable with any of the ideas put in it. It's very natural. And I think Ronald D. Moore got a lot of that from Battlestar Galactica, as I mentioned, working on Star Trek as well. It's a right way of doing it. You don't need to preach to your audience. Just put it there. That's it. People will accept it for what it is. So that's another great thing that I really, really like about that show. But for all of those good things, the issue with For All Mankind is that the show portrays an alternative timeline in history. What would have happened if the Russians, as it were, landed on the moon first before the Americans, as it were? So as a result of what goes on in the show, we see technological leaps forward. By the 1990s, humanity is on Mars, as establishing a base there and things like that. At that point, by the 80s, it has a massive base on the moon. And what it does is it reinforces just an extension of the accepted level of technology with the likes of NASA and that, i.e. rockets and things like that, and lunar landers and all these kind of things, spacesuits and traditional sense of how they were perceived via the lens of NASA. So really all it's doing at that point there is functioning as a what if PR tool for NASA. And I do know that there are a lot of people involved with the likes of NASA. There are people to do with SpaceX and things like that as well, who are actually involved in the production of the show, albeit as advisors and things like that, but they're still very much involved in the show. So is this another one of those shows, as I quite often say in these videos, is this another one of those shows that's portraying a perception management narrative, as it were, about what humanity has been able to do with regards to space travel. And what none of these things really do is talk about this notion of a secret space program, advanced technologies, anti-gravity, things like that. We're running with the narrative of white world technology at work, rockets and things like that. So there's a lot of these films and TV shows out there. I mean, this is just a few cursory examples for the sake of this video. If you do have any more examples, please let me know in the comments. I'd truly appreciate that. But as always with Strange Tales, I will leave all of this for you to decide what it's all about, what it all means. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please like, share, subscribe, all that great stuff. If you're interested in my alternative knowledge research, you can check out my books. They're available from Lulu Publishing and Amazon.com, the links to which are in the description for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again very, very soon. Bye bye for now.